Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a very, very special event for us for this evening. We weren't sure whether this event would be able to go ahead, but we're very pleased that it has been able to. And as I say, it is a special one-off event this evening. As I understand it, it's 100 years this month since Professor Tolkien came to Leeds University to read English language. So I'm sure you're going to go on a fascinating local landscape journey now with our own very own member, Claire Randall.
Well, thank you very much, Carol, for putting all this together in such awkward circumstances that we have at the moment. I'd also like to thank the Heart Centre for hosting this event. Obviously, there's a certain amount of arrangements that had to be seen to and everything like that. So here we are. Now, one of the reasons it gives me so much pleasure to be speaking here tonight, of all nights, is that I will be able to actually introduce the talk with a quotation from The Hobbit. Now, I do hope that people here really are up on their Tolkien, because I'm going to be throwing out a few choice gems for Tolkien fans here, and I know there are some here who aren't quite as learned in Tolkien as others. But anyway, you may recall that all the adventures began at Bag End, at the beginning of The Hobbit, where Gandalf and the dwarves all turn up, pile in and empty his larder, and they all have a fantastic time and everything, and they nearly break all the plates and all that. And then they sit down round the fire with their pipes, and they all sit down, and they're finding out about the tale of Thorin's ancestors, the tale of the Lonely Mountain, Smaug, all the gold and all that. And Gandalf says to Thorin, he says, "It was 100 years ago, last Thursday, when your father, Thrall, went away, and you never saw him again." Well, I'm very happy to be able to quote Gandalf here tonight, because it was indeed 100 years ago, last Thursday, when John Ronald Tolkien took up his post as a reader in English at Leeds University. So, when we were going to have it last week, I thought I was going to be able to say, tomorrow, it was 100 years ago when he took up his readership, but I can now actually, I've actually been able to quote Gandalf, so I can't tell you the immense pleasure that it gives me. So anyway, I'm not going to be talking so much about his literary works that he achieved while he was here in the 1920s. He became professor, he was made professor of English language in 1924, and he only stayed here for just over a year before he was able to go down to Oxford, and obviously that was his great ambition to have a chair in Oxford, and he achieved that at quite a young age, in his early 30s. So, his time in Leeds is somewhat kind of overlooked. It's the poor relation. There's a lot been made about his time in the Great War. There was superb work by oh Christ, his name slips me just.
John Garth.
John
Garth.
Garth, indeed. Yes, thank you for raising me. He very largely brought me onto the early Tolkien, actually, when I read his book, Tolkien and the Great War, a few years ago. And there was also John. Blackham, Stephen Blackham's Roots of Tolkien's Shire. And that's another one that goes into his childhood and how much that influenced his vision of the Shire. Now, so that leads me to the point about how some people say, oh, well, the things that come into his books may have been influenced by things he experienced in the, quote, famous term, the leaf mould of his imagination. But he didn't realise consciously what he was doing. And I think tonight I'm going to demonstrate that that's not necessarily the case. So, literary goal was what he called mythopoiesis. Now, he didn't actually invent the term, but he did popularise it. And this also goes in with his this idea that he had called the Tree of Tales. He had this idea called the Tree of Tales, which he kind of, when he wrote his book, his short story Leaf by Niggle, kind of refers to this, how you start with certain ideas and then you elaborate them. You fiddle around with it here and you fiddle around there and it grows a little bit and it grows off there. And that's what he did, basically. He started off with some of these ideas for the Book of Lost Tales at the beginning of the First World War, and he wrote some of them in the trenches, and then he wrote some more. And each time he kind of elaborated a little bit further, and he got a new idea, and he developed it, and the Tree of Tales grew, and then the Silmarillion grew out of the Book of Lost Tales, and then the Hobbit was kind of grafted onto that, and then the Lord of the Rings grew out of that. And to support my hypothesis that he knew what he was doing, I would draw attention to, in fact, what Stephen Blackham demonstrates in his work about Tolkien's childhood in Serral, and Tolkien himself admitted that that had influenced his vision of the Shire. So that's one starting point where Tolkien himself admitted it. Then there's another place that has been identified in East Yorkshire, in Holderness. He described a place where he had seen his, I think they weren't quite married at that point, but they might just have been, his wife Edith, dancing in hemlock umbels, and there was a tree with 3 trunks to it. And some researchers recently think they found a tree of the correct age for that. And Tolkien was quite clear. He said, yes, this was the inspiration for Beren and Luthien when Beren saw Luthien dancing in hemlock umbels. So that's another one, right? Then, say, oh yes, but, well, that's just 1 or 2. Well, 5 years ago, when I had the pleasure of making some readings from his Beowulf at the library just around the corner, I demonstrated, it's quite well understood by many people, that Beowulf is a major source for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. There's the thrall who finds his way into the dragon's lair and wakes up the dragon. Obviously, Bilbo, just a servant of the dwarves, the little thief, finding his way in, and then there's also the arrival of Gandalf and Aragorn and the others at the Golden Hall in I think it's the 2 Towers, when they arrive at King Théoden's Golden Hall. They go through the same rigmarole of proving their bona fides as Beowulf has to when he turns up at Heorot and offers services to King Black. So he was working on Beowulf while he was here in Leeds, and it only took 90 years to get it published. But so I think that we can see that there are a lot of there's landscapes, there's literary sources, and he's fully conscious of what he's doing with this. And people will sometimes say, oh yes, but well, he's just plagiarising. Well, no, he's not plagiarising. He's weaving together old fragments to make new stories. Right, so this is, I'm now going to go through a series of landscapes that some of you might know, some are local, some are quite so local, but I think that when I get to read out the quotes, I think you might find that some of this is quite similar. So, oh dear, can you reboot that please, Anna? Sorry, I talked on too long on the first one. Obviously, this is Professor Tolkien as a young man. I think this might be the photograph he's taken of him when he became professor in 1924. So, when I came to Leeds in the mid-1970s, I heard there was an urban legend. Oh yeah, Professor Tolkien had been at Leeds in the 1920s. and the Shire is based on Woodhouse Ridge. I thought, oh, that's interesting. I could see how he might have been interested in Woodhouse Ridge, but it's not the Shire, obviously, it's Ithilien. I mean, really, anybody who knows it. Now, I don't know if you can see this here, but we have Woodhouse Ridge extending from there all around there. Now, it's a sloping hillside, and in case you haven't got, I've got from the other end, we have this one. This is coming from the other end. It's the same view, but coming from the other end. So, if you think of Ithilien, there has a road going down the middle. Now, I'll see if I can find this is very interesting about the ridge, because when Tolkien came to Leeds, the ridge was falling back into being rewilded. This was just an inadvertent thing that happened. This is what it was like. You see, it's such a well-kept park. If you go there now, even now, 100 years later, you can find old drains and old gutters. And you think, this is a wild world. Where have people got these drains and gutters from, you know? At the Headingley end, it was a very well-kept park. And at the Headingley end, it was more like a woodland. And at the other end, it was a really well-kept park. This is quite a well-known picture of the bandstand. And this is obviously taken during the Edwardian period, or the turn of the century, obviously before the First World War, because one of the things that comes through in Tolkien's writing is that is the lost ages. You can tell the kind of crumbling ruins of civilizations that disappeared hundreds, thousands of years ago. And this is one of the effects that Tolkien uses so effectively in The Lord of the Rings, is to give this appearance of vanishing distance in time. So when he came, now this is something I think that he must have picked up from the Ridge, is that this is what it was like before, but because in August 1914, all this would have stopped. When he came here in 1920, just kind of gradually getting back to normal, but it was never going to be the same again, right? So there were never going to be these, bank holiday crowds. I haven't got enough space really to show this. There's one shot I found on the Headingley Leeds website, and this is from the Headingley Leeds website and the Leeds Museum, the Leeds Library Service. Shows the entire bank crowded with people, absolutely crowded with people. And of course, it's completely different now. The whole thing fell back. It's just like the way that Ithilien. It says here, the road had been made in a long lost time. The wild encroached upon it. The handiwork of men of old could be seen in its straight, sure flight and level course. Peering out of bushes at the side, old pavement stones still lurked amidst weeds and moss. Heather and trees and bracken scrambled down overhanging banks. It dwindled at last to a country cart road little used, but it did not wind. It was a fair country of climbing woods and swift falling streams. So it's actually the case that on Woodhouse Ridge there are actually springs that fall out. I have a friend who used to have an allotment on what's now the bandstand allotments below the bandstand, and he actually had a spring that used to come out in the winter from the ground. And this is what I think that Tolkien is describing. So we'll just go back a little bit. There we go. So my vision of Ithilien is, one thing is, it's a wooded bank that's returning into being wilded, but it was earlier cultivated, it was a kind of parkland. But then over the top, now, in Tolkien's day, well, there's still like a wall along here the whole way, and it's very steep. And over the top in Tolkien's day, there would have been old woodhouse covered, smoke blackened, like Mordor, and he reputedly used to walk on the ridge to get away from where he lived for 3 years up by the university over here. His wife Edith complained that the toxic fumes and smoke were so bad that their net curtains would dissolve. So that, we worry about air pollution these days, to think of what it was like in the 1920s. The whole place was completely smoke blackened. And so you've got, they come along here, now you've got the divergence here, you go up there, which goes into Woodhouse, Old Mordor. Along here, you've got the Ethelduath, the Mountains of Shadow. The road comes along. They see the Oliphaunt on the main road coming along. Then they get captured. There's descriptions of bracken, and your bracken on the ridge, and they get taken to Headingley, and this is the hidden layer behind the waterfall. And then he's taken out to a stand of rock beside where the old river used to be. And I've always thought that the bandstand, because if you stand on the bandstand, then it's like you're on a kind of watchtower. You can see the entire valley below you. Then there's the river at the bottom. It's like the Vale of Anduin. And so then we carry on. So I think this is, you see, one thing about Tolkien is that everything he did, everything he saw, he turned it in his imagination. Trees became ents, and bandstands became watchtowers over the valley, and smoke-blackened houses became dark Mordor, which is the way he describes it. So we'll go on a bit further. Then obviously this is how it's returned to. We've gone all the way from those lovely, kind of Edwardian Park to that. And then now here, if you know this part of the ridge, you'll know that there's a marvellous series of ginnels that goes up here. Now, I'll push through to the next one. That's the ginnel which leads up off. And that house that we just saw with the oriel window is off to the left. Now, so if we are on Ithilien, then this is at the appropriate place for the stairway over Gogoroth, over the Ethelduath to Cirith Ungol, and I would suggest that that could well have been his inspiration for Cirith Ungol, the guard tower, and that that's the stairway leading up. In fact, there are 3 marvellous ginnels which are like tunnels. The She-Wolf's lair, we go through the tunnel, right? And then that on the other side could be, so that's on the right-hand side, so that could be the Minas Morgul, the Minas Ithil. So I think there's a remarkable kind of correspondence of shapes. And so this is where I come from. As an art therapist, I'm interested in patterns. I'm interested in matching patterns. This is what art therapy is about largely. So what I'm doing is I'm matching. People might say, oh, well, it's just pareidolia. Pareidolia, you look at a cloud and you say, oh, I can see a horse, I can see this, I can see that. But the thing is, when you know that Tolkien saw this, probably hundreds of times he probably walked along that bit of ridge. It is a pattern match for his description of Ithilien and these various things. Perhaps there is a certain amount of my imagination, but it's no more than, I think, Tolkien's own, mythologization, the mythopoeic. You're trying to turn these things into more than they are. You're trying to make a story out of them. You're trying to make a mythology out of them. So, let's see, what else have we got? Okay, well, I'll just move on now quickly. So obviously this is Headingley. This is the original oak, the old oak, the Shire oak, that he, as it will have been about the time that he saw it. Now this is the stone behind that in the wall. I don't know if you can read it from there. It says, in front of this tablet there exists the Shire oak, which perhaps for old age on the 26th of May 1941. This, it is believed, was the place of meeting where the head of the Saxon wapentake, remember that word, the wapentake, the local government unit foregathered with his chief men. Leeds was in the wapentake of Skyrack or Shire Oak. So actually, Headingley was more important than Leeds, it's kind of saying. Now, next. Okay, now this is taken in the late 19th century, or not quite sure when, but obviously it's a photograph, but it's quite early. Perhaps 1860, something like that, before Headingley really kind of developed in the last quarter of the century. But it's a well-circulated postcard, and I think it's highly likely that Tolkien saw this. So we'll just have a quick look at what, where are we? Treebeard, right. It was like, where are we? I lost it. Anyway, basically he says he's like a 14-foot tree stump. And then his arms stuck out a bit like that. Right, so, although when by the time that Tolkien saw it, it was more like that, so the 1920s cars, I don't think that you can exaggerate the impact that this blackened stump must have had on Tolkien's imagination when he arrived here to spend his first few nights in St. Michael's Road, just up from the church, barely 100 yards from this, one of the most venerable and ancient Anglo-Saxon shire oaks in the country. I mean, he must have thought that he kind of died and gone to heaven in some ways, you know, to find that there was this shire oak, the wapentake. Now, where the stone is now behind there, you can probably recognise the bank building is still there, and the down, you know, heading towards what's at the Arndale Centre down there. Yeah, the wapentake. Well, obviously that's a big word in The Lord of the Rings, because King Theoden calls the wapentake at Edoras two of the riders of Rohan. The wapentake, this is obviously the gathering of the war band, the weapon taking, which obviously this is where the wapentake took place. So you've got a whole kind of complex of different things happening here. You've got something which I think is one of the possible sources for the Ents, Treebeard. You've got the wapentake. Obviously, there's no denying that, you know, he must have had some thinking about this at the time. Then I'm particularly amused by now. You have to remember, Tolkien was an expert in, well, more languages really than most of us could imagine. So he's first an expert in northern languages, Anglo-Saxon, Norse, Old Norse, Germanic, Icelandic, those kind of languages. But he also had obviously, you know, as a young man, as a student at school, he had obviously been taught Latin. So when I first read The Lord of the Rings, I immediately was aware, it was just obvious to me, you know, at the age of 14, that an Ent means a thing in Latin, ens entis a thing. But when you take this a bit further, when you find out a bit more about Anglo-Saxon, you realise that there's far more going on here. Because a thing, in Norse and Icelandic, is a meeting. It's like a parliamentary gathering of the clans. So the wapentake is also a moot. And it's a thing, right? And a thing is an end. So you've got this incredibly complicated interlinguistic pun going on about an end, which is a thing, which is a moot, and in the book, what do they have? They have an end moot. So, if you didn't follow that completely, I don't blame you. This isn't, but Tolkien was always playing with words, and I simply am not willing to believe that he was not aware of the pun that he was making, having the ents have an end root. It's just not credible to me. So anyway, so here we are. So this is the I'm sure there's one or two more details I could elaborate about that, but we'll move on to the next one. Rivendell. Now, it occurred to me a little while ago that Rivendell. Now, I wonder where what you might think this might be. So, this is from The Hobbit. They came on unexpected valleys, narrow with steep sides that opened suddenly at their feet. Gullies that were very deep, dark ravines one could neither jump over nor climb into. They came to a steep fall in the ground so suddenly that Gandalf's horse nearly slipped down the slope. Here it is at last, he called, and the others gathered round and over the edge. They saw a valley far below. They could hear the voice of hurrying water in a rocky bed at the bottom. There was light on the valley side across the water. They slithered and slipped in the dusk. They came to an open glade not far above the banks of the stream. Well, now this is pretty much a description of that, isn't it? This is Tolkien's own drawing of Rivendell. And so, where do you think it is? Right, does anybody know this? It's late 19th century painting by the marvellous painter Alfred de Briansky. And this is Knaresborough Gorge, Knaresborough Castle over Knaresborough Gorge. Right? Now, the thing that brought me to think that Knaresborough could be Rivendell, because obviously Woodhouse Ridge, obviously he walked there, there's no controversy over that, he knew it intimately, he knew every detail of it. Knaresborough, well, he did spend quite a few years in Yorkshire. Obviously in 1917, he spent most of his time in Yorkshire in 1917 because he's recuperating from his trench fever, which he caught at the Somme in 1916. And so it's highly likely, and also because he was here for 5 years in the 1920s, Knaresborough is only on the way to York by the scenic route on the line, so it's quite likely that he will have gone out on that route, and he will have seen Knaresborough Gorge. And the thing that struck me about Knaresborough Gorge, it occurred to me, was when I go across to York, I like to go via Knaresborough, if I've got the time, because it's such a wonderful journey. And the thing is that Rivendell is described as being, it kind of opens out before your feet, you're coming along and whoa! Well, there it is, there's this great big gorge in front of you, and it's kind of shown by Tolkien and other artists, being of this kind. Now, this is Ted Nasmith's illustration for the cover. Obviously, Tolkien, everything Tolkien does, he exaggerates it, right? So his artists have to be exaggerated. But you see, you have the thing that I keep saying, it drew my attention was that going there on the train, you're just in the kind of woodland, and then suddenly the gorge just opens out in front of you. And I couldn't help but think that made me think of this, because they come down from here, they arrive here, and then suddenly the gorge opens out. Well, you can't see it from the top. Suddenly it opens out, and then obviously, Knaresborough Gorge is quite a well-known beauty spot, and Mother Shipton's Well, I'd forgotten, is the oldest tourist attraction in the country. Now, this is one that I took And I have to thank my friend Rosemary for some of these photos, because she got me to Knaresborough. So again, you can see this is what it's like today. You've got the kind of bay coming round, and the kind of the conflation of the village and the old ruined castle on the top, I think, is very reminiscent of Rivendell, because you have the gorge, and it's very scenic, and it's very memorable. So all these places, you see, Woodhouse Ridge, obviously, he saw that on a regular basis, and I think it's very detailed thing of his imagination. But some of these other places are chosen, I think, because they're just beauty spots. They're just marvellous, unique locations that have character, and this is how he mythologizes them. So, what else have we got? And, okay, right, well, we're moving on to the next one. Now, this one people may find a little bit speculative, because it's a bit of a composite of things. But this is somewhere in North Leeds. This is North Leeds, and we're just over here. That's the Arndale Centre. We're probably just about there.
I can see my house there.
Can you? Well, don't point it out. But that up there is Tolkien's Darnley Road house, where he bought in 24, when he became made professor of English. He bought this house. It's a rather nice house, and he's literally only half a mile from this woods here. Now, this woods here is called Queen's Wood, after Queen Victoria, and it has marvellous, tremendous number of beaches. Now, I don't know if anybody's got any ideas for where this might be, but amongst this lot here, there's all sorts of features. For instance, he has Lothlorien has 2 rings of trees. Well, they're concentric, but here there's 2 rings of trees which are separated. But this is the kind of literary thing that he would do, kind of conjoin things, exaggerate things, separate things, pick out details, exaggerate them. Always, his mind is always reworking the details. So, in this part of Beckett's Park, so we've got all these tremendous tall beech trees, and it's been noted by many Tolkien researchers that beech trees are probably the basis for his Malham trees. The trees in Lothlorien are principally Malham trees, these giant, silver-barked, smooth trees, which of course it sounds like. Beech trees, and they have golden leaves which stay on the trees. Again, that's like beech, isn't it? Now, there are actually still some very, very ancient beech trees there. Unfortunately, due to mismanagement, and some of them have died recently, but this one, it doesn't look so huge, but that's about, kind of the person's about this tall next to it. It's got about a girth of something like 15 feet or something like that. And there were quite a number of these in that area. And obviously Tolkien was very, very interested in ancient trees. This was one of his things. So, given that he was only, 10 minutes walk away from some of these trees, this would have been his kind of go-to when he moved up to West Park, rather than, obviously, he couldn't get to Woodhouse Ridge. So, I think there are various springs coming out from here as well. And of course, in Lothlorien, he refers to how there are springs. There's a spring coming out from the bank. Now, this gets a bit deep. This gets a bit kind of detailed. Now, here we have Batcliff Wood, which was up the bit on the right-hand side of that picture. Now, Batcliff Wood, when viewed from Queenswood, is a very impressive kind of feature that, again, could be the way he describes when they see Caras Galadhon, which is the city of the elves. It's this mountainous green hillside that kind of comes out like this. I don't know if I can find it. Yeah, he saw at some distance the hill of many mighty trees, or a city of green towers, which it was he could not tell. And from a distance, this actually looks like that.
It would have been a lot more wooded, wouldn't it? Because most of these houses
yes.
Up there.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because we go on to the next picture. There we are. Now, this area, so it's very interesting how some of these things could be one thing looked at it from one angle, something else looked from another angle completely different, right? So here, again, we have Tolkien's house there, we have Queen's Wood there, there's the ancient beeches, the ring of trees. Then we have the bit here that I say looked a bit like Cartagarathon. But when you're in there, it's rather like Woody End, because where those houses that you've noticed are, down here, it used to be all marshy farmland, which is now being drained, and in fact there is there's a spring that comes out from here, I think it is, and it comes down here, and then the ground is all kind of damp and sloggy, and then it goes down through there, and then there's like an underground land drain. The reaches down here to, then it goes eventually underneath the railway line, and goes by the name of Black Sykes Beck. So you can imagine that kind of sounds like somewhere which is a bit kind of swampy, doesn't it? Black Sykes.
I've run and cycled all around that hundreds of times.
Well, so you know that
Yeah,
so there's this kind of bowl, and this is the way they describe it from Woody End. They climb down from Woody End. It's very steep there, and they climb down, and then they get into this marshy area, and then they look up because they see the Black Rider on the hillside. That's the poplar tree. They all look on the edge high above them. They saw against the sky, all standing. And then there's so you've got the marshy area down here, which is where Farmer Maggot's farm is, and then it goes down further to the river, which of course, the Brandywine River, in the Hobbit there is, in the Lord of the Rings there is the. So it's very interesting that all these areas, they have different kind of angles that can contribute to this. You know, obviously there were all lots of things going on in his mind with these. He would, it's like his literary sources, he would pick out details and put them together. And if there was something in the landscape that fitted the design of his plot, he would be able to describe that. Now this is just a slightly more detailed view of it. The marshy land is down here, there's the springs coming down, there's a spring there. But what you see here is actually, this is something else that you would have found interesting, although it's not a direct Lord of the Rings thing. But these are actually old medieval long furrows. It's not dry grass. Well, it is kind of dry grass, but the dry bits and the raised bits. And when this land must have been enclosed in like mid-18th century, they must have still been using it, because you can go there and you can see the ground has this kind of, you know, the remnants of these long furrows that, and then you can see there are different systems. I think some of these ones that go across it are probably the grass cutting, but you can see that there are a lot there. So that would have been very interesting to Tolkien, just as a kind of, you know, historian of the area, even though it doesn't particularly come into the Lord of the Rings. Now this one, since we're on the subject of centenaries, I happened to take this photograph last year on what would have been my father's 100th birthday, which was rather nice. So I took this from the Cow and Calf of Almscliffe Crag. Now I've got some super references I want to read about this, because now this is one for the real. Here we are. The real Tolkien cognoscenti, this one, right? So, in the Silmarillion, we have, this comes in the Silmarillion, but it's more detailed in the Children of Húrin, which is Again, it's something he actually wrote most of it while he was here in Leeds. I was just checking in the Scar and Hammond book, and it is recorded that he did a lot of the work on what now has been published by his son, his late son, Christopher, about 15 years ago, I think, probably. Brought out Children of Hurin, which is a fully kind of novelised, extended version of this story of Hurin, who was treated awfully by Morgoth, and his son Turin Turambar had an even more awful time in some ways. So anyway, the thing is, he at one point he takes refuge. Well, that's not quite hardly the word, but anyway, they come across this what they call a petty dwarf. He's a dwarf of a kind of minor clan who lives in, this is like another part of the receding ancientness of Middle-earth, because even in the Silmarillion, it's like, well, there were things that were so long ago. This has got caverns in it and stuff like that. Now this, Armscliff Crag, right, okay, so this is called the Bald-Headed Hill, or the Bareheaded Hill. I'll give the description. It says, it rose up on the eastern edge of the high moorland that rose between the vales of Syrian and Narog. So there would be, that rises between the vales of York and Wharfdale. The grey head was bare, so I think we'll just come a bit closer for it now. So the grey head was bare. The westering sun fell upon the crown. Now I have a friend, in fact it's the same friend who had me along with the spring. He has a flat in Otley, and I asked him, I said, can you see Armscliff Crag? And he said, yes, I can see Armscliff Crag from the back of his flat. And I said, does it ever get red in the sunset? And he said, it does quite often, actually. And although he doesn't describe it as being a red hill, he does say that there is a flower called Ceragon, which is red and which encircles it. So this is kind of, Tolkien kind of, elaborating again. So, and then he says there are dark dells and chimes. An opening ran back between two faces. So now here, there's some very interesting things in here, because there's obviously a bit of stonework. Go on, sorry. So, for instance, here, look, you can see somebody's carved out a chunk of rock there. I mean, it's quite a considerable bit of work, And then we'll go on a bit further. And then again, there's a little entrance here, which is a little bit like between two buttresses is a rock cave. And obviously, presumably there is indeed some kind of cave or entrance behind there. And also it says it has there's a bit more of it. You see, it's obviously been, and maybe that's only a farmer's field, and maybe only blocked up the cave because he didn't want a sheep falling in there. But it doesn't matter to Tolkien. It's some ancient, tale of disaster and bloodthirsty, people and orcs and things probably coming to it and stuff. And then he says that it's flat on the top. And of course, I didn't actually go up to the flat on the top. But yes, this is this amusing thing here I noticed when we were up there, is that I wondered if JRR Tolkien maybe just didn't have time to complete his full initials. So that's... anyway, so Armscliff Crag, again, is one that he would have known, because if you're going to, Knaresborough or York, you go over the Arlington Viaduct, and you can see Armscliff Crag on the horizon. So anyway, I'm going to have to... there's this quick one. This is Tullow Hill, King Arthur's castle, King Alfred's castle. Now, the thing here is we've got this long road here. You see, this is the Stonegate Road. This is Stonegate Road right along here. And we have Tullow Hill here. Again, probably tunnels and caves underneath it. And there was a folly there, which will have been there when Tolkien was there. And there we have it. You probably know this King Alfred's Castle. This is obviously taken before it was, demolished. That's another shot of it. You can see in a further state of decay. And that's the view that's about 1960 from the north, is what it would have looked like. Now it's very heavily wooded, and the views of it aren't quite so good, unfortunately, because the way that Tolkien describes it, I think this is Amonsul, Weathertop, where Frodo was knifed by the Nazgul, because you've got the old ruin at the top. Oh no, I'm just going back. So we've got the old ruin. There would have been the old ruin on the top, which overlooked that long road, which is what is described here. This is quite brief, but long ago, the men of the north built a great watchtower on Weathertop. So, Tolkien's always, oh look, there's a great old castle there, it's a watchtower, and it stood there watching, and then there's the next bit, here we go, so then they're standing on the top of there, looking down this river, this road, Stonegate Road, going all the way along from one end to the other. Because when I used to live in Meanwood, back in about 1980, and it wasn't so wooded, you could see from one end to the other, only the lower slopes were wooded, and then there were the tops like this, but you could see through them. Now it's all just kind of covered, and unfortunately the views are lost. But you could see from one end to the other, and far below, black riders were assembling on the road before the hill. So I think that, he's standing on the hilltop, and this is a classic old thing. You see some I'm standing out against the skyline, just like these trees. So I think King Alfred's castle is Weathertop. Yeah, because this is only in Meanwood. I mean, he would have walked there. Right, now this, Malham Cove, I only briefly saw this, and I just wondered if it might be something, but I wasn't quite sure. So I looked it up, and I didn't find anything about this, although I think I have found something. But it turns out that Gordale Scar is actually already thought of by many people. But we'll just go on to this. Now, I think that this is, people might know Malham Cove. Now here, there's a kind of crack in it, and the river kind of comes over. But I think this is the Emyn Muil, where Frodo and Sam try to climb down. There's this steep hill, there's this steep face. You can see how steep it is. Now, I think that's a person there, And then, what else have we got? Here, this one, right? That is a person, right? Can you see that? That's a person. When we went there, I was so grateful for Rosemary taking me there. I simply was, you remember how I was completely awestruck by the sheer size of Malham Cove. And then you look up at that, and it's staggering again, tiny little, you probably can't even see people if they try and... My friend with the thing, he says he climbed across one of those when he was a child. I don't think his mother would be very pleased to know that. Right, now this is how so this is looking down. This is a drone footage by someone called Kitestu, which is on YouTube. So, see, here we have like a gully, and then there's shelves, and then you can go down, and there's overhangs, and this is exactly how Tolkien describes them getting down. I think I'm probably running out of time, so I won't read those from there. He said this is actually how you come down here. This is the crack that comes in. You see, and they describe broken limestone pavement. So this is a really good look at. Now, Gordale Scar and Malham Cove, I don't know. Now that's Janet's Foss, which I just threw in there because this is a cave. This is a waterfall with a cave behind it. So that's another thing that might possibly fit with Henneth and So, but we just kind of, there's so much that you can see you kind of almost had the opportunity to mix and match. Now, but I don't know of any documentary evidence of whether he ever went to Malham. So we've done all the others. They're all places that you either knew well, or you could well have known, or you most likely knew. But I don't know. I haven't been able to find any documentary evidence of him and his family ever going to Malham. But now this is Gordale Scar. Now when I looked it up, I saw that Gordale Scar is apparently thought by many Tolkien fans to be Helm's Deep. And I can well believe this. So I don't claim credit for this. This is one that's already out there. So you have this massive chasm basically winding in, and then you've got the overhanging cliffs. There we go. Now this one I got from, this was a drone footage from Claire French, is the name of the person on YouTube. And so you've got the valley coming in here, the green sward, and you've got this massive here, where I think is like the, from some angles it looks like a kind of castle, which would be the Hornburg, and then they kind of go in here, and then there's like, it literally describes, it kind of curves in the way that Tolkien describes Helm's Deep. So I think this is very credible. And a little detail that I liked is that just a bit further down there is this stone wall with a fence going across. And it's really interesting the way that Tolkien describes the culvert and the way that the orcs try to get in under the wall because you have to have some outlet for the water. And I just thought there's so many details there that if they're expanded in the imagination, you know, that's the place where the orcs got through. So, and then the last one here is, I'm sorry, I think I'm just about there. This one, now this is looking down on Gordale Scar from above, the same Claire French footage. I'm really impressed with this. Now, so here we see that the river is coming along here, and it cuts through here, and it opens out here. Well, the opening out, obviously, that's quite simple. But actually, now this is something again from the Silmarillion. This could be, well, what happened, I'll explain what happened here, is that Gordale River was an underground stream that has apparently collapsed. Right? So you can kind of see here where the river, you can kind of see where it's all caved in without using the actual footage and only lots and lots of photographs. It's hard to kind of show. But I understand from reading about it that Gordale Scar indeed is a collapsed river, and in the Silmarillion, the great river of the Silmarillion, Sirion, comes down from the north. It goes into an underground stream, and it comes out in a waterfall below, just as this would do if it was before the limestone casing had collapsed on it. And of course, going back to the Helm's Deep interpretation, of course, it says that there are many caves, the glittering caves of Aglarond that Gimli wants to take and show to Legolas. And of course, the entire limestone plateau is just completely riddled with caves, underground stream flows, because it's limestone and it's just been eroding, and the Ice Age did a lot of work on it, and it's continued work on it since. And I think that is it. So there we go, that's the end of the sequence. So there's so much more I could say about, but there's also, I've just come across, I think Whitby might be something, because he went there a couple of times. I think Whitby could be the Grey Havens, but I'll leave that for another time, and I know that we're pretty much hit the time limit, so thank you very much for everybody for humouring me with my postulations about Professor JRR Tolkien's influences from the Yorkshire landscape. Thank you very much. And so if you want to go and take a break momentarily now, and we'll take questions in a few minutes. Again in a moment.
Yeah, well, it may be one of the influences that led to that. Yeah.
Well, the Yorkshire limestone
landscape. I don't think different sorts were then developing
the way it is at the
imagination.
moment,
In 1911, but he was...
Right, so everybody, I'm told that we're obviously a bit tight on time this evening, so I'm sorry I haven't had as long a break as we might have had, but if anybody has any questions or if they'd like me to go back to any of the skills, yes.
Very quick question.
Yes.
Etymology about weapon take. I assume from what you said, it's a sort of weapon taking.
Yes.
It's effectively a call to arms.
Well, it is, but I think that historically that's how these things arise. And then when you're not going to war all the time, well, at least you're kind of already organised, and then it becomes a kind of organ of government.
Right.
So I think that's the kind of the way that it went.
So originally from a sort of call to arms.
Oh, I think so, yes, because when you think about, you know, what is known as the Dark Ages,
Yeah.
you know, clans and groups would, you know, organise, and then, you know, it's like, this goes back to the kind of, you know, the traditional concept of the nation and the government's, what is the principal duty of the government or the king is to protect the people, so the king or the government has to organise, you know, defence. You know.
Another very quick question. I love your talk.
Oh, thank you very
Fascinating.
much.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Have you, or do you plan to write the whole thing up?
Yes, there's one or two very short blogs that I've written about it.
Right.
If you just look up.
I was thinking one about something more substantial.
But I am planning, yes, I have, in fact, I have a project that I'm trying to draw to completion at this very moment and get out of the way, because I really want to do this. That's a rather serious project I have, and I'm almost there, and I'm almost finished. I just got to get it done. There's so many obstacles and things. But I really want to get onto this. I could
make a great book.
I would love to, I was thinking that so many photographs to include, I would love to make a coffee table book out of it, really. But, so when hopefully this video goes up onto YouTube, hopefully we'll get up onto YouTube without too many glitches. And if there's anybody out there from HarperCollins who wants to approach me about making this into a lovely, big, fat, juicy kind of coffee table book, I would be ever so delighted to do so. I shall probably have to, in the meantime, just make up a kind of ebook of it, you know, like a Kindle, because obviously there are so many photographs. Turning into a fully illustrated paper book, particularly hardback, would be, you know, quite a big job to do. So I would need some kind of publisher or some.
Yeah, there must be Yorkshire publishers also.
Well, perhaps I can draw attention to this. I mean, I've been on this for a few years now, but it's just starting to blossom, and I'm starting to realise how much there is there. And you know, I've led a couple of walks around things like the ridge, and you know, talked about my ideas about Ithilien and stuff. And I think you know, it's obviously. I start out with Ithilien and the ridge, and I'm absolutely sure about that. I mean, I really think there's so much going on there, and he must have known it so well that I don't really feel any, you know, kind of doubt about that. But obviously, the further on you get with some of these other things that become a bit more fragmentary, and there's a bit less supporting evidence that you might have known of places and so forth. So. But the further you go down these things, then you find so many correspondences that it's quite fascinating. And he must have, well, he was here for, you know, more than 50% of the time between the beginning of 1917 and early, late 1925. In fact, he would, yeah. So, you know, 7 or 8 years of being around Yorkshire most of the time. He must have known it quite well. And, you know, he will have heard about places, and I think that he had. Oh, it's like, well, Terry Pratchett. Some of you, you know, may have heard Terry Pratchett say, "The thing about Tolkien, he's such a good writer about geography." I mean, it's a very Terry Pratchett kind of thing to say, isn't it? Really? But also, it's not just geography; it's geology. Now, a lot of these, some of these. Oh, no, lost the picture again. Sorry. Some of these, for instance, when I've read the book many times, for instance, I always found that the geology of, say, for instance, the Emyn Muil, I found it, I wasn't really entirely convinced. And then I finally, after many, many years, I finally see actual Malham Cove, you know, and I'm finding it is exactly as he describes it. And it's just that it's such an unusual feature.
Is there actual evidence you did travel to there? Do you know?
I haven't been able to find anything, but I was just talking with somebody in the intermission about how the work. Obviously, he was around Yorkshire a lot. He was interested in this kind of thing. The rail network was better then, and there was lots of frequent trains. And on times like bank holidays and stuff, there would have been charabanc tours out to these places. Like obviously, Knaresborough was already a well-established tourist spot. And Malham Cove and Gordale Scar. I mean, when we went up there, although we didn't really know that much about it before we went, we found out a lot more, obviously, as a result. And I was incredibly kind of just impressed because, Malham basically seems to be kind of built around, the tourist feature of Malham Cove and Gordale Scar, and then the extra little walk for Janet's Foss, which is a very nice little diversion as well. And then I found myself wondering if Janet's Foss bore a certain resemblance to the Vale of, I think it's the Vale of Nimrodel, is it? Pauline's probably one or another. But that's just another, you just kind of get all these resonances and they're just kind of too many to kind of handle almost. But I can't help but wonder whether he must have seen. I mean, that picture there is virtually, a representation of the location where Sam and Frodo managed to get down the cliff face. There's even old thorn trees clinging to the rock face that they, try and hold on to as they're coming down, and there we are, there's these flat, and then there's the overhang, and then there's the little shelves, and then finally they managed to fall on the spongy grass in the bottom.
There wouldn't be a lot of that around Oxford, either, would there?
Sorry?
There wouldn't be a lot of that around Oxford.
No, well, exactly. So, where are you going to see something like this? Like I say, I always read the book and I thought, this is one bit of Tolkien's geography that I don't find terribly convincing. And then I finally do go and see this, and I have to confess that I was wrong. This is it, or it's so like it, that... And if it was just this, but then you've also got Gordale Scar, two major geological features, slap bang next to each other. You visit one, you probably go and visit the other, you hear about them. And they're two major unusual geological features in the books, which stand out, as locations. So I can't help but think that, maybe there will be some note. I've looked in his letters, I've looked in Skull and Hammond, haven't found anything. There might be something, but I shall keep looking.
Did he keep diaries?
Not really, no. Lots of more letters. Lots of letters, so I was hoping that there might be some mention that. But then I got a copy of his collected letters, but then there's only a selection. So there's a lot of stuff that got left out. A day out in the Yorkshire Dales probably wouldn't have featured there, necessarily, because obviously the letters, they focus on things that relate to, one, his career movements, his marriage, and things to do with his literary works and his publishing and stuff like that. So if anything relates to that, but even if he did say something like, oh, well, we took a nice day out to Malham Cove, or looked at some wonderful landscapes and stuff like that, it's not. It was only in the very later years that people would interview him and winkle out these kind of references. Oh, yes, well, of course, the old mill from Serrell. Yes, well, of course, that one. Yeah, but yes. But, he this was only you know, when the Lord of the Rings came out and people were already pressing him about what this meant and, you know, where the Hobbit had come from.
Influences.
Yeah, the influences. But in the earlier stages, before the war, before the Second World War, in that interwar period, I don't think there would be any reason, you know.
Of course, there's a huge mass of unpublished letters, which we may or may not eventually see. But also, of course, sorry, I'll try and, that might make me sound more audible. Tolkien was a great sketcher. I mean, he filled lots of sketchbooks.
Indeed.
And as we understand, only 10% of all his sketches have yet been published as well. So it could well be that we'll eventually find a sketch which will shed some light on this. I mean, he did, for example, do a number of sketches of scenes in Whitby, which you mentioned Whitby before.
Yep. Well, that would tend to support my hypothesis that Whitby might possibly be, you know, influential in something like the Grey Havens. I hadn't really thought about Whitby, and then I just came across it when I was scouring through Skull and Hammond for references to Malham.
But it's not in Skull and Hammond, it doesn't exist. I mean, that is an extraordinarily exhaustive work. I mean, poor Tolkien, he's probably had his life more minutely documented on a day-by-day basis than anybody who's ever lived.
Yes, yeah. Well,
it's extraordinary.
The Donald Trump of the 1920s, you know.
I don't think that. Well,
I'm referring to the examination under a microscope. But yeah, he's probably, he is certainly, his daily activities are extraordinarily well documented. Yes.
What do you think motivated his creativity and desire to write?
Well, I think he was just a very creative person. I think he was a kind of, I think he had a kind of animistic view of the world. But when he was in the sixth form, he had several friends. Unfortunately, lost two of them in the First World War, and they had this group called the Barovian Tea Club, and Society Barovian Tea Club, and they planned the new artistic movement of the 20th century. That was what they planned. They said, we are going to be the new, you know, like the pre-Raphaelites or whatever from the 19th century. We are going to do this. So when the two, you know, most enthusiastic of these, one of them survived, but he was a bit of a quiet chap. The two who were most into this, they died in the First World War, and Tolkien felt a tremendous weight of obligation that he had to carry on this this regeneration, this new movement, and of, you know, artistic and literary endeavour. And he was the last one left standing, and I think this must have contributed to his sense of the First World War being a disaster that wiped out civilization, you know. So he was very, very motivated to do that, and I think he was already a kind of deeply kind of spiritual person who was very saw a kind of panpsychic, providential view of the universe. That God worked through everything, and then so these things like Treebeard or the landscapes, they come alive. I think Carol wants to answer that.
So,
thank you very much, Carol.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd just like to give Claire a big round of applause. So thank you very much, Claire, and I thought we'll see something, maybe a little booklet or something in the future.
I think it was quite easy to get a video out of this.
Yeah, that would be great, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, you're very welcome, and thank you everybody. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I certainly have. I found it very interesting. And we look forward to seeing some of you again soon this month. We've got our poetry evening coming up on the 21st of this month with Mark Connor, poet, and there will be another